Good morning, everyone. This is the Vermont House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development. It is Tuesday, April 29th, 2025 at 9:32 in the morning. So now we're here to look at a redraft of the CHIP portion of S-127. We have our legislative counsel with us, John Gray. John, good morning. Thank you for coming in to see us this morning.
You guys, good morning, everyone. John Gray, Office of Legislative Counsel. I will try to be efficient here, and I think we can be with this draft 3.1. So pulled up the screen share here. There's a couple of things you're not going to see. So maybe I'll just orient for purposes of this. As discussed on Friday, this will remove the incentive structure, which had two competing, or not competing, but two different avenues to have different increments based on whether or not you achieved affordability. So one thing that you'll note you don't see here in the definition section is that affordable housing definition and affordable housing development, because those affordability pieces have been pulled out. You have now more of a kind of standard approach, more akin to what came across from the Senate. So that's been pulled out, but you'll see a couple of other changes throughout the draft. So what you see here at the bottom of the page, we talked about how this housing development might be restricted to just new construction. And so language has been added here to make clear that rehabilitation or renovation could constitute housing development. So this could mean that you take an existing building and you're actually rehabilitating it to create housing. That would be permissible under the program with this particular addition. Similarly, the definition of improvements, this moves this back to some slight tweaks, basically what was received from the Senate. So you have I'll call out the pieces that are distinctive as against the Senate. So we've added rehabilitation here. Previously, this said installation or construction of infrastructure. We've now made clear that you could be fixing up infrastructure that might be dilapidated or something's off with it. And all of the listed indicative examples are the same, except as what was received from the Senate, except that instead of saying transportation, you now say roads, bridges, sidewalks. And I think the thinking behind this was just that transportation sounds like cars. If you said transportation infrastructure, that might be clearer. But this is just spelling out what those kinds of things are. And in any case, these are all just part of a list of included, right? These are all just included items. So really, if you're trying to get at what improvements are, it's installation, construction, or rehabilitation of infrastructure that serves the public good and fulfills the purpose of the subchapter.
Okay.
Should we leave it at transportation infrastructure? No, I guess not. Maybe not.
I don't think you're losing really anything here by doing this. I think this is just getting at the connotations. Transportation has absent saying infrastructure.
No landing pads. Or trains.
But I mean, if the infrastructure served the public good and fulfilled the purpose of the subchapter, could be. Yeah. So,
If there were pieces in there that we took out
yes.
and said that if you provided more than X amount of housing, you can also access these improvements.
Mhm.
So if we remove them from there and put them in there, that means they're not available here, right? They'd be available here.
Yeah, if you had a dual structure, that's right. That's right. And the way that we had the dual structure set up was that the broader bucket basically referenced this.
Yeah. I'm just thinking, is that something that we should think about? Are there pieces here that we could remove, like public facilities and amenities that could go into another bucket for projects that are, 70% housing or 60% housing or whatever, just to try to incent more housing. We're not creating a dual, 70%, 80%, but somehow providing some structure to incent more housing, because this is housing, right? Something to think about.
Would it make sense to have the incentive be that they could use it to pay for the energy codes? Or is that too much entering, bringing in something new?
I'd like to understand better what is out there for, that they can access for energy.
Yeah, like other loan instruments.
Yeah,
And I think that part of what we had talked about on Friday was just that the scope of the program, right, is infrastructural improvements. That's what you're financing. But at the point that you start pulling in other things that may not be infrastructure, you are changing the scope of the program, which is something you can do. But just to call out, one of the initial, there have been in the past project-based approaches to TIF that were quite broad. Like when Spark was rolled out, it wasn't limited to infrastructure. It included anything basically you would be changing the scope of what you're financing by doing things like energy specific. And I don't, yeah.
I'm thinking about, what you just posited with two different classifications and some type of incentive. And I think it might depend on, what that second category is all about. What those might be. And I'm thinking the main sort of infrastructure needs to be stuff that is really essential.
Mhm.
And I was hoping to get away from. I'm not sure if this is the right time to talk about, there might be other ways to incent or to make sure that the select board and Betsy, take into account the purposes of the whole program. That might, I don't know. That could be another way to get, look at the kind of thing you talk about. But we can get to move on.
okay.
Keep rolling. So let's jump down to the housing infrastructure agreement. So we're on page 6. And what you see highlighted here is just condensing language. It's actually removing something that was in the prior draft. So previously we had a term, we had a dual structure here to say provide terms to ensure that, and then we had this primary residence piece as you had here, but you also had an affordability piece as well. We've stripped out the affordability piece, so you just see that condensed into one provision. So provide terms to ensure that any housing unit within that housing development be offered exclusively as a primary residence throughout the life of the housing development site. So that is until the financing is retired, you would have covenants in place or through contractual terms that those housing units would be offered as primary residences.
Some, the LCT has some concerns about that being in the agreement. They'll be in this afternoon to talk to it.
Okay.
I think they're, because the housing agreements between the municipality and the developer, they don't know how they can enforce that. I'm thinking, but I don't know that they really have to enforce it. I think that there would be that there would be an attestation by the developer that those are, and if it's found out later that some are not being used as primary, it falls back on the developer and not on the municipality.
So, yeah, no, that's interesting. So part of why I had included this here rather than elsewhere in like the project criteria and standards or something like this was the thinking that this meant Betsy doesn't have to undertake to monitor this particular piece, which was one of the concerns we'd had about including these kinds of like long-term check-ins on the housing itself. And so the thinking was that this is just something that has to be contractually negotiated. The municipality has an incentive to ensure that these are offered as primary residences. So my thinking was that they have to agree in this agreement with the developer. The developer is going to say, we will offer these exclusively on this basis. And basically the municipality would be the one who would want to enforce the measure, was the way that I had thought about it. So the municipality would be incentivized as a party to that agreement to challenge if the developer was violating the agreement. That was at least the thinking behind it, but we don't know, of course, what.
And I think that's what VLCT is worried about. Now municipality becomes the enforcement.
Yeah, the way to look at that is that not a real good real estate lawyer, but typically those kinds of things would be put into a covenant, of some sort. So that there wouldn't necessarily be any need for the municipality even to enforce it, it's a covenant,
Yeah, you might put a covenant on the deed or if you're gonna do a project like this, it would be unusual for it to have some sort of HOA. And it would be in that as well.
Like,
But if the developer does break the agreement, it's not gonna cause any problems with the TIF funds, correct?
I don't think that the condition for getting access to the financing, right, is that your application is submitted. And one of the conditions there is that your agreement conforms to the standards of this section. So I don't think that the financing itself is contingent, right? Like the financing approval is contingent on you having an agreement of a particular form. Someone's choice to then later violate the contract is separate from the actual thing that got you access to the financing. I mean, but it is a good question. If folks are just openly violating all of the conditions that we set out, like what kind of restriction is that at all?
well, and that should be spelled out in the contract as well.
Right. And so I think the final term here, this provide for performance assurances to reasonably secure the obligations of all parties under the housing infrastructure agreement is meant to capture that generic concept that each party is protecting their interests. But we are, in having this agreement in place, saying that parts of this are subject to contractual negotiation. You are being open to things can happen under the contract, and you're just trying to set out general terms to guide that process. And I think that this last one is what is responsive to that particular concern. Like if someone violates, what happens? The agreement should set out what happens in that event.
Well, yeah, and then like with your covenants and your HOAs, I mean, that's all spelled out in there. If I put when the developer buys the property, there's gonna be a covenant that says you cannot rent this out, you can't reset, whatever. And if they go and do that, first of all, it wouldn't be the developer, it would be more likely the new owner took possession of the property. And then you have a title enforcement issue there, and that would go through whatever processes they do in real estate. That on my pay grade there.
In that situation, who's that like initial reporting going to?
So when you do the covenant, that would be filed with the town. And what would happen is if I bought property and I wanted to if I wanted to say rent it out, it would be the responsibility of the realtor or whoever or the attorney to say, no, you can't do this because the covenant says you can't. And then
Rent it, just not like short-term rental.
Right.
yeah, whatever the covenant says. I mean, I've seen crazy stuff. I mean, I've seen covenants that say you can't have bicycles outside on your lawn. So,
I guess my concern is that the municipality is gonna play a role in there at some point.
It's a homeowner association thing.
Mhm.
It's all about the homeowner association at that point. The
With
homeowner
the co-
association, the covenants within the homeowners association, so it becomes an internal thing within that homeowners association.
But can't we have, it's possible to have covenants without HOAs.
correct.
I mean, it only becomes an issue if we're not asking the municipalities to go out and police everything that's happening, right? They have a contract, it's a responsibility of the, whoever they're contracting with, the developer or the sponsor, right? So, whoever is owning the properties, if they're selling the property as a home, then there'll have to be some type of covenant in something in the deed that says up until a certain point, this has to be a primary residence. And if they're providing apartments and rentals, then that's something that they have to follow through the life of the chip until it's paid for. We're not asking the municipality to go and check every year that every unit is primary residence. But if they do find out that there is an issue, then there's pieces there's parts of the contract that are gonna specify what they can do.
And what you're seeing here is not trying to be prescriptive as to the specific method by which they achieve this. It's just saying, make sure that you do include terms that do this, and it leads them up to the negotiating parties as to how they perform that piece. And so this, both 4 and 5 would get you to that place, but it's not exhaustive as to how you get there. It's assuming that the parties have a better sense of what they need to do to build these things in than we do sitting around the table, basically.
And I would add, this isn't new. I mean, there are covenants on properties all over the place, and obviously you need someone to report it, but there are already systems in place to deal with covenant violations. So I don't know as if we necessarily need to reinvent the wheel.
And just from a practical standpoint, looking at time, I'm happy to proceed as however you guys want, but if you would like for me to get through all the changes in the draft this morning before you guys have to go to the floor, that's doable.
Okay, let's go.
All right. So let's jump to the application section. We're looking at the project criteria. The last draft had a 60% gross floor area requirement dedicated to housing. You now have a 40% gross floor area, as discussed on Friday. And then we have a new addition to the location criteria. So we've talked about Tier 1A, Tier 1B, and existing settlement. And just note that there's a future section that has a future effective date related to Tier 2. So that's the reason that it's missing here. But as discussed on Friday, we basically have a route for projects that are ready to go to not have to fall into these buckets. And so what you see here is BEPC shall review the housing infrastructure project application to determine whether the housing development site is located within one of those areas, so Tier 1A, Tier 1B, or existing settlement, provided that a housing development for which all permits required under Act 250 have been secured as of the time of application, meaning they're rolling in the door with this application, they have their permit secured, they shall be deemed to have satisfied the location criteria of this subsection. The effect of this is that what it really means is there's no location criteria for a project that has all of its Act 250 permits. That's the effect of this. At which raises another point when we get to the end and we talk about the expansion to Tier 2. At a point, you may have such broad swaths of the state covered by these tiers that it almost begs the question, why even have a location criteria if it's just going to be you can build anywhere in the state? But we don't know yet. But anyway, that's what this particular edition is saying. If you've got all your permits, you don't need to fall within Tier 1A, Tier 1B, or within an existing settlement. We can jump down to page 14, the use of tax increment retention period section. And there are a couple of substantive changes in this section. So one is a clarifying piece, trying to ensure that there's a clear process that a municipality can follow if they're relying on a non-municipal sponsor. So what do they do with their increment when they're paying it out? What this new highlighted text says is that a municipality may provide that tax increment to a sponsor, as we've been contemplating this whole time, but they can only do it upon receipt of an invoice for payment of the financing, and the sponsor has to confirm once that increment has been applied to the financing. So this is just a way of ensuring that the municipality is being safe with the increment that it provides to the sponsor. But basically the sponsor just has to pass along the bill that they have or invoice, whatever they might have for the financing, and then they confirm when they've actually applied the payment. So this is just kind of a good faith check-in on that, the way that money is flowing. Not changing anything about the actual structure of the program, just ensuring that municipalities know what they need to do. You see this subsection B highlighted. This is not a novel concept. This is just reducing from that two-pronged structure, which had a 70% and an 80%. This is now condensed into one. You don't have that dual track process, so you just have up to 70% of the education property tax increment may be retained for up to 20 years. We talked on Friday about conforming the excess tax increment mechanics per BEPC recommendation to what applies to TIF districts and what came across from the Senate. So that's what this new language is. You'll recall that the last draft had that concept of retaining only 30% and putting it aside essentially for rainy day. This is just using the normal excess tax increment mechanics that we have for TIF districts. And this is what came over from the Senate. This piece is a fairly substantive change and is in alignment with that the mechanic discussion that BEPC that Jess had with you guys on Friday. So this is a way of downward amending the retention percentages. It's a 10-year check-in, and this is what's currently done for TIP districts. We didn't have something like this for this proposal, so during the 10th year following the creation of a housing development site, so that would be April 1 of the year in which VEPSI approves financing for that project, communities shall submit an updated financing plan to VEPSI, which shall include adjustments and updates of appropriate data and information sufficient for VEPSI to determine, based on the financing debt actually incurred and the history of the increment generated across that period, whether the percentages are appropriate, whether they should be continued or adjusted to a lower percentage to be retained for the remaining duration of the retention period and still provide sufficient increment to service the remaining debt. So the idea here is that if they check in and see that you can cover your financing with a lower percentage based on the data that you provide to them, this is a way of saying we can make sure that more money is available to go up to the ed fund. We could downward amend those retention percentages. And again, this is something that is currently done for TIP districts. So this is not a novel thing. VEPSI is used to doing this. I think our last pieces are at the very end, which is a nice place for the last pieces to be. I did want to call it, there's some bracketed language in the Community and Housing Infrastructure Program Board section. They're really they have a substantive impact, but they're fairly administrative. So who should serve as chair of this board? The language, the placeholder language I'd include had the state treasurer as the chair, but just to ask you guys to at some point confirm if you would like to do that. And similarly for administrative support, it might make sense to house it in the agency or department where the chair is. So that would be the officer of the state treasurer as currently set up, or the way that it works for the TIP district program, that administrative support currently comes from ACCD. So these two might be logical places, but if you change the chair, you might consider a different location. The last piece is your location criteria, and consistent with what we discussed before and on Friday. You may recall that on Friday, I had struck the existing settlement language and replaced it with tier 2. I've studied that. So you now retain the existing settlement language and you add in this area designated tier 2. So you're picking up tier 1A, tier 1B, existing settlement, and areas designated tier 2. Note that you still have this proviso. So someone who comes in the door with all of their permits secured can build throughout the state. They don't have to fall into one of these buckets. The last piece here is just the effective date. I previously had this set as contingently effective to be, this is kicking in that tier 2 piece. I had this contingently effective as a year following the first designation of an area as tier 2. In talking with my colleague Ellen, there was some concern that that contingency is a bit too loose. There could even be an argument that a tier 2 designation exists as of today, because the way that tier 2 works is that it is everything that is not another category. So just to make sure that you don't get wonky effects, I have proposed just doing this a year following what I take to be basically the earliest possible date at which maps would be available. We've been talking about that 2027 date. So I have this as January 1, 2028, which would provide you time to look and check in. But that's why instead of having a contingent effectiveness, I just have a designated date. And hopefully that provides some certainty to folks as well. But consider whether you would want to push this to July, or just depending on the appetite you have for getting a chance to look. And in any case, you're going to have years before, so you can amend it as you see fit.
Thank you, John. We will come back to this. I think you're with us at 1 o'clock.
I'm here at 1. Yep.
So, I know, Herb, you have a couple of suggestions. We'll look at that. We'll hear from the LCT, their argument of not putting that in. And if there's anything else that anybody has seen that they want to talk about or ask to make changes to, we'll do that as well. Hopefully we can get John for longer than 30 minutes this afternoon.
Yeah.
So we're on the floor. We have 2 bills coming up. And we'll be back here at 1 o'clock. So after the floor, caucus is lunch.